welcome to this roundtable discussion on digital space, the new frontier of civic space. This is one of several sessions during Stockholm Forum for Peace and Development, looking at challenges and opportunities of new technologies. The aim with this discussion is to explore the links between civic space and digital space, the rights and responsibilities of tech companies, governments, users, as well as the pathways to ensure that digital space could be an enabler for engagement and for democratic development in the MENA region. This discussion takes place in the context of a shrinking civic space in many places of the world, and of course in a situation where we, during the pandemic, have seen that much of the engagement, the activism, the dialogues has turned online. In this conversation, we will ask whether the civic rights are also applied in the digital space, and if not, what can be done to address this issue. A decade ago, there were many who pointed to the great benefits of the digital space in terms of advancing democratic dialogue and broadening participation, not least due to the hopes that were born in connection to the Arab uprisings. Later, we have seen a techlash with growing concerns about individuals, organizations, and governments taking advantage of new technologies for harmful purposes. Digital disruption of democracy has been witnessed throughout the world, including during Brexit and in a host of elections around the world. We have also, in the MENA region, seen the shortcomings of the shrinking digital space. Our presumption is that digital platforms can be both a detriment to and a tool for democratic engagement and fostering of peace. By discussing the challenges and the opportunities and issues like content moderation and transparency, we will hope that today's session will deepen our understanding of how digital platforms could be a vehicle to strengthening inclusive participation and democratic space, and mitigating risks of polarization, and ultimately contribute to the development of peaceful societies. None of this discussion can, of course, take place without also recognizing the risks and the limitations. To help us navigate this important and challenging topics, we have assembled a diverse and very impressive set of speakers, whom I would now like to welcome and introduce. We have with us Dr. Rasha Abdallah, who is Professor of Journalism and Mass Communication at the American University in Cairo. Rasha is a former member of the UN multi-stakeholder advisory group of the Internet Governance Forum. She is the author of The Internet in the Arab World, Egypt and Beyond, as well as several other Internet-related books. Dr. Waleed Saqaf is Associate Professor at Södertörn University in Stockholm and works on research in the interdisciplinary domain connecting technology and journalism, including press freedom, social network analysis, big data analysis, spread of disinformation online, open source intelligence, and so on. Before coming to Sweden, Waleed worked as a journalist in his native country, Yemen. Marwa Fatafta leads Access Now's work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa region. She has previously worked as the MENA Regional Advisor at Transparency International Secretariat in Berlin, where she is still based. Dr. Mohammed Ghadira is the founder and president of Shnoa Barnamij, and the first political and technological think and do tank of Tunisian youth that aspires to become the leader of digital democracy, not only in Tunisia, but also more widely in the MENA region. Dia Khiali is Associate Director of Advocacy at Mnemonic, aka Syria Archive. In their role, Dia focuses on the real-life impact of policy decisions made by lawmakers and tech companies about content moderation and related topics. She has previously served at Witness. Sara Lindblom serves as Senior Advisor in Democracy and Human Rights at the Middle East North Africa Unit at SIDA, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. She has worked extensively with human rights and international humanitarian law in the MENA region, including with several civil society actors. We also have, last but not least, Nadeem Nashif, who is a social entrepreneur and digital rights defender. He is also the founder and executive director of Hamlin, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media, a Palestinian digital rights organization. My name is Charlotta Sparre. I'm the director of the Swedish Dialogue Insitute for the Middle East and North Africa, a Swedish governmental agency working with the MENA region on issues like peace and security, sustainable development, and inclusive participation. I'm also joined here today with my two colleagues, Johan Berggren and Noora Beruba. The format for this discussion is a roundtable discussion where we will first have a moderated discussion with our eminent panel, and we will then open up for a couple of questions from the audience. So please, if you have questions, post them in the chat, and my colleague Noora will take care of them later on. This is an extremely exciting topic, and we have lots of ground to cover. Time will be our greatest enemy, and I will therefore have to ask all our speakers to try to be brief in your comments. So let me now move over to a first short question to all of the speakers. New technology, as we have said, or as I have said, can be both harmful and helpful to democratic processes. This may be grossly simplified, but I would still like to ask you, where do you stand? Do you consider digital platforms more of a detriment to, or a tool for democratic engagement and for fostering peace? And why? And brief answers, just 30 seconds each, please. Thank you.
Rather than the other way around, there was a time when we all witnessed how social media sort of opened new pathways, particularly in the MENA region, and at least facilitated what was referred to as the Arab Spring. And it did play a huge role in making people feel that they have a space of their own and they have a voice to, to say in the affairs of the region. I think now that the governments have sort of caught up with the space, it became dependent on the amount of freedom allowed. So, if a country allows, a particular space, then obviously very robust conversations can happen. To the extent that governments crack down on that space, then these conversations begin to disappear.
Thank you, Rasha. We'll come back to you later. The 30 seconds are gone, and we'll ask you to dwell a little bit more on that in a second. Waleed, what is your take?
I'd like to add to, I agree with what Rasha has said. I'd like to add that media in general, media technology is a conduit. It is a technology, so it depends on how you use it. And so the difficulty with the governments in the Middle East, for example, is that they often see technology as a means of control. And that's been in the tradition of authoritarian states. So if it gives access to individuals that they don't are not warm to, then it might end up using the technology to suppress them. So it is a catch-up. Every new technology is a learning curve for governments. How do we take over control? And so that's the difficulty. Unless we find a silver bullet of a technology that is inescapable and escapable from governments, we will continue in this loop, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. So we have both Rasha and Waleed saying it depends. Marwa, what do you say?
Thank you, Charlotta. I belong to the 49% camp in the sense that I believe technology is not neutral. So it can be used both for good or for bad. Some technologies or new technologies like artificial intelligence technologies has proven there's a well-amounting evidence that they are biased by design, and therefore whatever the outcomes of their use will entrench further discrimination, racism, and social injustices. I mean, for social media platforms, I think it's important to note that they are commercial platforms built for profit. And therefore, we're always facing this contradiction between human rights, including freedom of expression, and the goals or the ultimate goal of those companies, which is making more and more money. And therefore, so even though it's important to note that activists and civil society organizations and journalists from the region and around the world have utilized those platforms for social justice purposes and political democratization, among others. But the reason why these technologies or platforms were built were for commercial purposes, and I think that's the main challenge. You know, the business model of those companies or these platforms is a great challenge and detrimental to human rights, among other issues.
Thanks, and I'm sure this is also something we will come back to later in our conversation. I would like to ask the same question to you, Mohammed. What is your experience from your work in Tunisia?
Good morning, everybody. So actually, thank you, Charlotte. Actually, I believe that digital space can be a catalyst for democracy. In 2011, and with the beginning of the Arab Spring, social networks played a major role in the liberation of speech, the dissemination of information, and the organization of protest movements. However, digital space can also be dangerous for democracy when it participates in spreading conspiracy theories, fake news, or speeches that express hate or encourage violence. And I'm sure that we will come back to this in our discussion.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And Dia, over to you.
Thank you. It's very easy answer for me coming after everybody else. I have to agree with what everybody has said, and maybe to jump a little bit on Marwa's answer. I am part of the 49%, but I also still maintain the 33% optimism. And so I'll say, I think it really depends on who you're asking. It depends on the context. And finally, I'll end by saying, you know, it's when we talk about digital platforms, even though Facebook is a global company, Twitter is a global company, many of these platforms are global companies, they're not global platforms. And what we experience in our region is not the same as in another region, as in another country. And so, you know, we have to fight to make sure that we get that 33%, that we get the optimism and the ability to use the platforms. And that's part of why I think a lot of us do the work we do.
Thanks a lot, Dia. And Sarah, what is your take?
Yes, hello, everyone. Well, I agree with the previous speakers that this is an issue how it is used, that it's not neutral by itself. And although there are, a medium for control, like Waleed mentioned, for repressive regimes. And there is also a lot of lack of accountability. It can be misused and abused for disinformation, propaganda, but also surveillance. I think the opportunities and the potential benefits as a vehicle for democratization and human rights, I think are very important, and that is one of the reasons why we support it as part of our, overall work on democracy and human rights.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And last but not least, over to you, Nadeem.
Yes, so well, I agree with the different colleagues and what have been said. I mean, it's obviously a dual thing, and you can see it from both sides, and depends how you use it. But I think it would be interesting to go by the timeline and to look, especially at our region, what was happening before the Arab Spring and what happened after the Arab Spring, and basically that it was much more free internet and social media before, and less laws and legislation. So we know that there was a wave of legislation of cybercrime laws in different Arab states. There is a wave in the last decade, we could say, of much more use of algorithms and different surveillance and techniques by the governments and different oppressive regimes. So I think in our region, we can see it also from the historical kind of point of view or timeline, that things became much worse and much to deter rather than to a positive use.
Thank you very much, Nadeem. And even though, as I said, the question was clearly very oversimplified, and even though many of you agreed with one another, I think you all managed to show some of the enormous complexities, and that this is really a question that has so many different facets. So I would now like to move over to the question of how we can try to work for making the digital space really being treated as civic space, including ensuring rights and responsibilities to protect and promote a free and open digital space. And I would like to start with turning to Rasha. You have been working in Russia for many years on these issues, examining them from an academic perspective. And I would like to ask you to build on what you said earlier and to explain what is the state of play in the region today, and how can we achieve the ambition of treating digital space as a civic space?
That's an excellent question. That's really the heart of of the whole thing, and that's what people have been trying to do. I was about to say that with the advent of new technologies always comes a new opportunity, and I guess, and Waleed put it pretty well. It's sort of a cat and mouse game right now. So I mean, if those who use the technology for acquiring a bit of the civic space are ahead in the technology game, whatever new platforms or new technologies come around that they can use to sort of carve out a public space for themselves. That's really how it's done. Governments basically catch up in a while. I think in the Arab region, we were quite lucky around the Arab Spring, because for the longest time, governments did not think of online space as real space. I mean, we have the famous joke of Mubarak saying, let them play, خليهم يتسلوا, and up until it culminated in revolution, pretty much. But then governments really paid attention, because they realized that a lot can come out of this, and so they started really cracking down on that space all over the Arab world and the MENA region. And that herein lies the challenge of how can you carve a space for yourself that later translates into sort of an actual public space rather than just a virtual online space before the governments can get to you. It really is a cat and mouse game at this point. What keeps me optimistic is that, you know, young people who are at the heart of this technology are always one step ahead when, you know, when they come to tech savvy matters. So I do realize that what Marwa said is very realistic and practically correct, but I am a bit optimistic that young people are always ahead. Of course, there's a lot of crackdown on, you know, whatever they might be able to come up with, but you know, all it takes is a window of opportunity one of these days, and you know, people just keep fighting to increase the virtual and the literal space that becomes available to them.
Thank you very much for that, and we will get back later on also to the discussion of what is it then that can actually be done to try to protect that space. And towards the end of this discussion, I very much look forward also to the recommendations of all of our speakers in what is it that possibly can be done by different actors to, so to say, enhance the positive aspects. But I would now like to move over to Waleed, and you have also been working on these issues from different angles. And I would like to hear your perspective. How do you feel that the freedoms online are actually being protected in the MENA region or not? And what is it that needs to be improved?
And thank you, Khaleta. I mean, I believe that the notion of absolute freedom doesn't exist anywhere, absolutely. But in the Middle East, it's absolute suppression that exists. An example here is social media. If you can imagine, in the form of Twitter as a social media platform, in the past, there was not much government that's oversight. I mean, there were no really monitors, people monitoring what's going on. But once activists started flourishing on these platforms, the government created new strategies. For example, that's my daughter in the background. For example, the trolls that have taken over. And so the mechanism of creating new repressive measures are really, on the one hand, impressive that they have so much intelligence in finding out the loopholes, the methods. And recently it's become a pattern to see disinformation launching via pro-government the bots that are trying to persuade the public in accepting a different reality. So we are dealing with a very challenging dynamic. It's not only censorship as it used to be. It's now a much more nuanced approach of tackling or attacking freedom of expression.
Thank you very, very much, Waleed. And I would like to move over now to Mohammed and hear some of your reflections and on the work in Tunisia. What has been your experiences in establishing your organization in the work that you are doing?
So, as you know, Tunisia is going through a period of democratic transition that began in 2011 after the Tunisian Revolution. So about 10 years ago, in Tunisia, the internet was totally controlled by the state through a special agency called the Tunisian Internet Agency, created specially for this specific task. The state, therefore, had the means to censor the pages they wanted, and we did not have access to several websites where they could criticize the government. Today, things have totally changed in Tunisia. But if I'm telling you this story, it's because that in reality, the state of freedoms in the digital space depends intrinsically on the state of freedoms and human rights in the public space according to the different and existing regimes in the Middle East and North African countries. The organization of which I'm the founder and president, called شنو برنامجك, which means what's your program in Arabic, and is the first political and technological think and do tank of Tunisian youth, founded in 2019 on the occasion of the presidential and legislative elections in Tunisia. At شنو برنامجك, we work to build and promote digital democracy in Tunisia, but also in the MENA region, through the development of technological solutions in order to solve political problems. We have thus developed numerous digital and political platforms to strengthen citizen engagement, to promote exchange and debate with politicians, and to raise awareness among citizens on political, economic, and legal issues. to strengthen their analytical capacity and raise the political debate to the top. And I will come back to our various platforms in more details during the second part of our discussion.
Thank you very much. But maybe I can ask you already now, Mohammed, to just say one word on what has been your main challenges.
During when we found the Think and Do Tank, our main challenges maybe was to engage with politicians, because as you know, we started only in 2011 having democratic debate and democratic discussion. So at the very early beginning, when we start our work, it was a little bit complicated to explain to politicians that they need, and it's part of their job to communicate about their programs, about their views, about their positions, and specifically on issues that are a little bit complicated, and people, and politicians, they don't want to always talk about very transparency. So I will give you more details after, but the the most important issues and for us was how to engage with politicians and to keep them accountable and give them the possibility to express themselves about positions they don't always want to express them about.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And listening to all of you, I think you really make it clear how connected the two spaces are, and if there is a willingness and a certain room within the civic space, there is also more room within the digital space. And with the let's say the challenges and the opportunities being very, very different from one country to another, and of course the difference within the MENA region is extremely important to keep in mind in this regard. I would now like to move over to another set of questions related to content moderation and transparency, and the much debated issue of content moderation, the role of tech companies. It is of course also very difficult to look at these questions without considering other elements like state surveillance and censorship and self-censorship and online threats. None of you have yet mentioned Clubhouse, but I think that this new platform and seeing how many people have been say going on board and have joined, and the discussions, at least many of the discussions that I have listened into, have been quite fascinating, but where at least my thinking is constantly who is listening to this and where will it lead. Many people think that social media platforms have a responsibility to manage and moderate misinformation, hate speech spread by users, and yet we see that the companies are adopting very different approaches to content regulation, and this has led to a growing debate about the boundaries between moderation, deplatforming, censorship. So the questions that I want our speakers to look at is the roles that you see that tech companies play in content moderation, both when it possibly comes to preventing biases and helping avoiding lack of understanding in the MENA region, but also what should their role be, and are they also potentially playing a negative role? I think it would also be interesting if you could reflect a little bit on what is or should be the responsibility of governments. And here I would like we would have liked to hear a voice from a tech company. And I have to say, we have made repeated attempts to get a representative from Twitter or Facebook or Google or any other tech companies to join us, but regretfully we did not succeed, and we are sad that that perspective cannot be heard here. We are, however, very glad that we have the panel that we have with us, and I would like to first start or turn over to Dia. Mnemonic has established a rapid response project working in close collaboration with Syrian reporters and documentation groups to preserve digital information with Syrian reporters, documentation groups, and to preserve information on the Syrian conflict, images, photos, other postings. These are all invaluable historical elements and potential evidence of both human rights abuses, but other parts of history as well. So how have you had to deal with the issue of content moderation and transparency?
Great, thank you. So, you know, I think we are in an interesting position at Mnemonic because many of us are located outside of the region. And so we have a strategy. We try to address this issue in multiple ways. As you mentioned, first and foremost, of course, we are trying to find as much content as we can and verify and preserve it as quickly as possible. And in fact, the need to do this has just increased exponentially in the last few years. In particular, and this is one of the big reasons why I'm a part of the work at Mnemonic now. In 2017, Google started using artificial intelligence to find what they decided was terrorist and violent extremist content. I say what they decided because there's really not any agreement on that internationally. And so at that time, we started seeing content from Syria and also from other places we work in just getting deleted in a way that we hadn't seen before. I mean, the content oftentimes gets removed, but it was just happening incredibly quickly. And so one of the things that we do is we try to preserve as much as possible. When we hear that there is a lot of content being deleted rapidly, sometimes other civil society or non-traditional media or the people just creating the videos will reach out to us to help try to preserve that content. So that's one thing, is just trying to save as much as we can. Also trying to spread the word to people to let them know, you know, this is what can happen if your content is on Facebook or on YouTube. Here's how you can get it off and save it, or here's how we can maybe help. But then the other thing that we are doing, and this is a lot of what my work is of course policy advocacy. And we're actually doing it outside of the region. We are doing policy advocacy, particularly in the EU. We're seeing, as I mentioned, not everybody has the same social media platform. Using these platforms in Syria or in Palestine or in Lebanon is not necessarily the same as using it in Germany or using it in Sweden. And that also is because we don't necessarily have the same representation with these companies. They don't have the same interest in addressing our needs. And so it's actually very, very helpful and very lucky that we do have, I think, a growing sort of collaboration between organizations that are inside the region and organizations that are outside, so that we can do sort of what we call diaspora organizing and enable people outside to be doing that policy advocacy, because it is very important. And you know, we may not be EU citizens or US citizens, but those policies affect us. And so we're trying to do that advocacy as well. I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Deanne. Maybe you can just say one word or a couple of words on how the archive then works. So say, who can access it? What is the how do you collect it and organize it and so on?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, you know, we've talked mostly about Syrian archive. We also have Yemeni archive and Sudanese archive. And each of the archives is a little bit different. I'll speak mainly to Syrian archive because it's our oldest. It's been around for many years now. And so we get content for Syrian archive from a variety of sources. Some we get directly from people who created the video or people who are somehow managing to get it outside of the country. And a lot of it we find on social media platforms. And so we have, in particular, trusted channels that we look at, non-traditional media houses, people who we know are really prolific in documenting human rights violations. So we get that content from all of those sources. We have a very stringent process of verifying the content, so ensuring that it is actually what it says it is. It's a video coming from, you know, Syria in 2017 instead of somewhere else in 2012. I mean, we have seen sometimes that sort of issue. So really ensuring that it's verified and then putting it into specific collections. So we have collections looking at sometimes specific attacks, the bombing of a particular hospital. And we sometimes will organize it around, this is a series of chemical attacks. This is a series of attacks on civilian infrastructure. And then finally, of course, so we get the content, we verify it, we put it all in one place, and then we want it to be used. So sometimes that content is going to international bodies, sometimes it's going to the United Nations, sometimes it's actually being used in court cases. And we are seeing, a variety of kinds of court cases. We've seen cases, and this is again a reason why it's really good for us to be in the EU or in countries that have universal jurisdictions, such as Sweden. This is something that has really enabled prosecutions in a way that we've never seen before. And so we've provided information directly to courts. We've actually filed information to try to get cases started and have been successful there. So it's just it's a whole process from beginning to end. And I've come in on the policy advocacy side to make sure that we're not losing that content, that we're not losing the ability to find it, and that people aren't losing the ability to post it where we can find it.
Thank you very much, Dia. I think that was very useful information for those who are not familiar with your work. Before turning over to Marwa, I would just like to follow up on the chat that my colleague Noura posted. Please, if you have any questions to our panel, we hope to be able to pick up at least some of them later on. Please post them in the chat. So Marwa, your organization Access Now defends and extends the digital rights of users at risk around the world. How do you perceive the challenge of content moderation and the lack of transparency in the MENA region?
Thank you, Charlotta. There is a multitude of issues, so I'll try my best to be as succinct as I can. We have been working on content moderation issues and censorship, online censorship, pretty much since the Arab uprisings. We were founded in 2009. We have a helpline available around the clock for activists and users and civil society organizations, where we receive cases of internet shutdowns, account shutdowns, or content removal, and so on. And so I think over the past decade, it would be fair for us to say that unfortunately, the content moderation or the social media platforms policies and the way they moderate content coming from our region is discriminatory and in many cases arbitrary. The social media platforms have a set of policies or terms of services that are supposed to be universal. They should apply to all of their users, but the reality speaks differently. We sometimes see an over-enforcement or over-compliance with their policies, and I think the case from Syria is a perfect example, and the work that Dia and Mnemonic are doing makes a case in point, where content seen as violent content, graphic content, terrorist content, quote unquote, because as Dia mentioned, it's a definition that is not specific, and there is no internationally recognized one definition that applies to all. And as a result of that, we see a huge amount of content being removed from the region, mostly content that documents human rights violations. I mean, the region has, I stopped counting on my fingers how many active wars we have in the region. And so when people are reporting from the ground, uploading pictures and videos and documentation of human rights abuses and violations, they are sometimes graphic by nature. Nevertheless, they are important, especially in the absence of independent journalism that can report on the realities and lived experiences of people. And so often you'll see that this content is removed, sometimes even before it's seen, not only in Syria, but also in Palestine as well. In addition to the over-compliance, sometimes also you see that there's lack of enforcement of their policies at all when it comes to Arabic content, when it comes to disinformation campaigns, hate speech against activists or against gender minorities, against women. In the region, we see that platforms are responding extremely slowly, if any, to that content or sort of content. And I would say the reason behind that is lack of investment, really, in terms of resources, but also in understanding the context of our region, appreciating, of course, that it's very diverse and it's not one block of context. Every region or every country has its own set of dialects and language, its own complicated and complex political context, social context, and so on. And this is compounded by the fact that social media companies use automated decision-making tools to implement their policies. And then again, those tools are machines that don't really understand and don't have the capacity to understand nuanced context, and therefore leads to the mass censorship and mass removal of content. And last thing I want to add on this front is the lack of transparency, both in terms of how companies develop their policies, in addition to how they implement them. We see sometimes very problematic policies that are tailored to very specific content coming from the region. I'll give you a couple of examples. Facebook has been implementing a so-called shaheed policy, which criminalizes the word of shaheed on the assumption that shaheed equates or means glorification of terrorism. So when you use that word shaheed in addition to an individual or an organization that Facebook considers dangerous, this content is removed. We don't know who these people and organizations are that Facebook considers to be dangerous. There is no transparency about that. And there is also no transparency about the genesis of those policies. How do they come into being? Why is it that this word has been determined by Facebook as a dangerous word that could incite to real world harm? So there are lots of question marks there. There's lack of transparency with users themselves. When your account is being shut down or your content is removed, often you don't know why, you don't know the reason, which policy have you violated, and you don't have access to remedy or redress. You can't challenge that decision. In some cases, your account or your outreach is also restricted and you don't know why, and that relates to the use of algorithms for either demoting or making certain content viral. And transparency related to the relationship between governments and the social media platforms. Okay, so I don't know if I used all of my time, so I'm happy to continue later on in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Marwan. I think also it was very useful that you were highlighting also some of the reasons behind this. And I guess this is something that maybe we can come back to in the recommendations later on also. How can this then be addressed? And I would now like to move over to Nadeem. Your organization, Hamla, supports social media activism with an aim to raise social awareness and political consciousness of disenfranchised and marginalized groups. Can you very briefly share with us, because our time is now running very quickly, but if you can share some quick experiences of content moderation and transparency issues in the context that you work.
Yes, thank you. So in my context, the problem is that it's there is no transparency and there is no any kind of justice in how the social media platforms, and more specifically Facebook, is dealing with content moderation. So we have one side that is basically want to control the market and want to get the most of profits that they can, in this case, Facebook or another social media platform. And on the other side, we have a government, a strong government, that want to control the narrative on the social media, want to decide which narrative will be there, what is allowed and what's not allowed. And as it was mentioned before by Dia, so who decide basically what's terrorist and what is terrorism? Who decide what is incitement and what is violence? So the decision making is basically happening by the power relations. So the power relations on the ground is being reflected on the social media and the internet. And coming more specifically to the Palestinian case, the Israeli government obviously have a strong links and strong relationship with Facebook and the other companies, being a market, being a much bigger market. Let's compare it with the Palestinian market, for example, in the ads and in the money. Being stronger in the technological aspect and having technological relations also with Facebook, and also having lots of political connections and influence that is happening. The result is basically that Facebook, almost in 90% of the requests of the Israeli government for takedowns, they answer positively. These takedowns requests that coming from the Israeli cyber unit are not requests by order of a court. They call it a voluntary request. So basically, it comes from the cyber unit that is in the Israeli Ministry of Justice. They decide that certain Palestinian content is incitement. So for example, if a Palestinian sitting in Bethlehem or in Ramallah would say, and I would like to also remind us all that this is not a normal reality, it's occupation reality. So if this unit send the request to Facebook and say, this guy is saying, I want to get rid of occupation, this is incitement by the Israelis, and Facebook follows the Israelis. And the Palestinian user cannot go and appeal to anybody because there was no court even. Nobody discussed that with him. It's just something that's happening directly between the Israeli government and Facebook. And we are learning now that there are more than 15,000 requests a year, and each request contains tens of specific requests. So you can imagine how big the size of this takedowns and silencing any voice of asking for their rights and asking to be free and not to be under occupation. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Nadeem. If you don't mind, I would like to move the conversation forward and maybe also ask the same question to Waleed, who have been working with the Yemeni context. What is your sense of the situation? What do you see as the main challenges, and how can they be dealt with?
Thank you, Rajata. The challenges in Yemen are connected to the conflict, obviously, and that's the elephant in the room. And the complex repercussions, both globally in the creation of the world's worst humanitarian crisis, as well as locally, where instability and lack of resources to live normally happen. The internet and social media have exacerbated the situation in some way. For example, in the cases of conflict, there are parties disseminating information online, creating a narrative that is contradictory, leading to distrust of the public. And this has created a form of lack of interest in getting information from the internet. In the past, it used to be a source of inspiration, a source of information that you can use to get knowledge. But today, it's become more of a propaganda tool. And unfortunately, the level of moderation that you mentioned is impossible to pursue in such a situation, because you have to have a fact check almost for every single tweet or every single post of the different sites. So what happens now is that we are considering that instead of looking at it from Facebook or from a top-down approach, we are also considering the bottom-up approach of media literacy, of informing the public, because you can't give tools to the public and then let them try it on their own and navigate. You also need to empower them with education, with knowledge, with training, with an ability to leverage that. So coming from an educational background, we pursued a long-term ambition in Yemen to help educate the public there through media literacy, to understanding how the tools operate. What is possible, what is not, when to notice that there's something skeptical, and when to be skeptical, when to not directly share information. we've trained trainers that became trainers themselves. So the training paradigm is now being accelerated in Yemen. Despite the lack of resources, we have one of the worst internet connections in the region, in the world. And despite that, we see a lot of promise in enabling people to learn, to use this knowledge and to pursue it so that they can use their freedom of expression to become more informed and later on become less prone to be in the conflict and make it even worse.
Thank you very much, Waleed, and all of you for your reflections on this. I would now like to move our discussion into the question of let's say, the social media or the digital space as either an enabler of participation or just serving as creating more polarization. I would like you to reflect a little bit on what is the potential for us to, let's say, get out of the bubbles that we very easily get into, and maybe even more due to the algorithms. How can the tools be used in a positive way? So, of course, not ignoring the challenges, but still looking at the potential. You've all been pointing again and again to the enormous complexities in this, the positive potential and the enormous risks that are there. This time around, I would really have to ask you to be extremely brief in your responses, because we also have some questions from the audience that I would like us to be able to address. But first, over to you, Marwa. Can you maybe say a couple of words on what you see as the regional trends, and to what extent you see that the digital platforms can be a provider or an equalizer, so to say?
Thank you, Charlotte. I mean, we've been advocating for social media companies to uphold their responsibility and their public commitments that they've made to respect international human rights law and to ensure that their policies and services and does not violate or do not violate people's fundamental rights, including their right to freedom of expression in the region. There is no doubt that social media platforms are gatekeepers. And I would say, if I want to make like a comment about one trend, there's absolutely a battle of narratives in our region. Whether it be, I mean, first of all, social media platforms have provided the space, indeed, especially in 2011 to citizens to express themselves and to share a reality that is outside of the official state narrative, which was fully controlled by governments. You have now this space, and people wanted to share freely information, access information also freely. But unfortunately, as already mentioned, governments caught up with the trend as well. And they can't control, obviously, everything that is being said online, and they don't have the capacity. I mean, they try their best to pressure social media companies to remove content they don't like, but they don't have the power to actually censor it directly themselves. So what do you do in this case? You have state-sanctioned troll armies, you have disinformation campaigns with the aim to discredit and delegitimize the narrative of activists and revolutionaries and political dissidents. On the other hand, unfortunately, in particular contexts, such as the context of Palestine, social media companies develop also policies that are biased or one-sided. And here, I mean, I really like the framing of the Syrian archive when YouTube removed their content, that it's an erasure of history, and it's an erasure of narrative. And this is where social media companies must really pay attention to the public commitments that they've made and fulfill those, and ensure that they are not lending a hand to the wishes of governments in the region to censor and suppress voices coming from our region.
Thank you very much, Marwa. And I would like to turn over to Mohammed. You are working in Tunisia, in maybe the country in the region that has been opening up more of a space. So I would like to ask you, do you see the glass as mainly half full or mainly half empty? And can you explain why? And again, a very brief answer would be good.
Thank you, Charlotta. So I got a question on the role of youth in peace building and also about our website. So I'm going to answer to both of them. First of all, I'm personally a national optimist. So I can only see the glass half full. And thanks to the work done with Shon Barnamjik in Tunisia, I have reasons to remain optimistic. And let me explain you why. During the election of 2019 in Tunisia, citizens wishing to vote found themselves totally lost and confused, not knowing who to choose with more than 200 political parties. With its first political program comparator in Tunisia and an online quiz, Shon Barnamjik made the task of choosing who to vote for less daunting for more than 500,000 citizens, particularly youth, who used our platforms during the elections. After the elections, we launched 3 other political platforms to strengthen political accountability, foster inclusive dialogue, and strengthen communication between elected officials and citizens. Our first platform was Raqab.en, the political monitoring platform that allows any citizen with an internet connection to follow if the head of government and the president of Republic in Tunisia are keeping their promises. This does not only allow the citizens to stay up to date with events and achievements, but also hold the head of states accountable. Our second platform was Ekbilhom.en, which gives to any citizen the opportunity to express his concern or ask questions to any elected deputy. Through this platform, our purpose is to reestablish the trust between the citizens and their elected deputies in order to solve the crisis of representative democracy. Finally, our third platform was the Box of Questions, which is a series of short educational videos that sensitize the Tunisian youth eager to discover the political, social, and democratic scene in their country. Topics vary from actions taken by the government to laws passed, and this diversification aims to tackle as many topics as possible. In Shon Barnamjik, we are creating a virtual community dedicated to youth that promotes activism and positive thinking. The sole purpose of this community is to give space to youth to freely ask questions that come to their minds, listen to different points of view, and easily engage in debates. To attract young people, we are developing gamification process on our platforms, because when we see how trending games are nowadays, we think that it will be a great asset for us. Therefore, by simplifying matters and making them fun, we aim to engage and educate at the same time. Finally, digital democracy has conferred us that amazing power of making things look very reachable and easy. And I believe that digital space can be a great way to promote peace, justice, and to create an inclusive political dialogue, especially with young people.
Thank you, Mohammed. And Dia, I would like, based on all your experience, to hear your views on say how the risks for new divides and risk for hate and threats can be dealt with, and also to what extent that the digital platforms can provide avenues for both peace building and justice, but also for advancing gender equality. And again, I would like to, I know it's a big question, but still I would like to ask for a brief answer. Dia, are you there? I don't know if we have lost Dia, or if you are just on mute. There you are. While Dia is fixing her microphone, I turn to Raja, and maybe you can just tell us how you look at the situation. Do you still see that opportunities outweigh the risks of the new technology, or is it the other way around?
It's kind of a down moment that we're in right now, I have to admit. We're not at our most powerful or most productive or fruitful moment when it comes to social media. As many of the speakers have pointed out, I think the platforms right now have gotten much in control and are, you know, are not interested in well, they're interested in making money, as Marwa said, and in order for them to do that, they have to comply with the policies of whichever countries they work with or in. And so it's the end user is the least powerful entity in this formula. The question is, I mean, we become powerful if we all get together, right? Because, you know, Facebook or Twitter or whichever platform have literally billions of users. So, I mean, to the extent that we can get together and sort of exert pressure on these platforms to do something about the issues, then we become more powerful. But at this moment, it's all in the hands of the platforms, and the platforms are not being very transparent about what they're doing. So we literally have no idea, you know, we have no idea why certain accounts are suspended, or sometimes there's even a more dangerous phenomena, which I'm looking into these days and engaging the help of Marwa and Access Now. I believe some accounts are just muzzled. So the account is not suspended, but you don't reach anybody. So, you know, you can't go to Twitter, for example, and say, hey, I'm suspended, because I'm not. But, you know, I can tweet and nobody will reply to me, even though I might have, you know, thousands of followers. And so how many people am I reaching with my tweets? What's the reach of my tweets? We have no idea. Has Twitter actively muzzled some people, or Facebook, or, you know, Instagram, or whoever, whichever the platform is? Have they muzzled some people? We have no idea, and we have no way of finding out. That's the problem, and that, I think, is even more dangerous than account suspensions, because, you know, if you're suspended, you're suspended, so you can take it to somebody and say, hey, why have you suspended this account? But if you're muzzled, you know, on the surface, you're fine, your account is active, but you're talking and nobody's listening, basically, because nobody's seeing your tweets or your posts or whatever it is. And that, I think, is a very dangerous situation. And unfortunately, the platforms are not being transparent with any of their policies. We have no idea how the algorithms work. The algorithms, we know for a fact that the algorithms work to sort of deepen the echo chamber and the bubble effects, you know. So you on Facebook, for example, you only see posts from people that you interact with. You only see people you only see posts from people whose posts you like. You know, the more you like posts by a certain individual, the more their posts appear on your timeline. So that just enforces, you know, whatever you're thinking, and really sort of draws a shell around you from any other idea that is different to yours, and thus amplifying the echo chamber thing and increasing polarization. And that, I think, is a very dangerous phenomenon. So we need to work with the platforms to pressure them to become more transparent, basically, to tell us what's happening, and you know, to tell us how can an individual user find out what the you know, what the reach on their posts or tweets or pictures or whatever it is that they're posting is, and how is that affected? I mean, we know for a fact the platforms tell us that sometimes they downplay content from a certain user. We just don't know who these users are and why and when that happens and for how long. Is it permanent? Is it temporary? When is it lifted? Why does it happen? We have no idea. And that, I think, is even more dangerous than the straight out suspension or ban or whatever, because at least that you can see, but muzzling an account you do not see. And so I think we need to focus on that.
Thank you, Rasha. And the difficulty that I mentioned earlier that we had in even getting someone to participate in this panel or even answer to our messages, I think is unfortunately very telling. And it is, we would very much have liked to had a tech representative on this panel to hear the views and the discussions, because this is something that I think is a growing concern all over the world and in different contexts. But I would now like to very briefly go back to Dia before we move on. Are you with us, Dia?
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Sorry about that glitch earlier. Rasha, thank you so much. I just second everything that she said and say that in a way, although we oftentimes in our region, we see trends, we see things. So the trend Rasha was talking about, we talk a lot about shadow banning. People are suddenly losing their reach. Sometimes we'll also see suddenly that certain words seem to make things get removed automatically. I think a variety of trends that we've noticed. And so in a sense, platforms do still provide opportunities for justice, provide opportunities for organizing, but I think it's actually in spite of them and not because of them. I think people in our region in a way have really become experts, even though we don't know what's happening sometimes. We've become experts at understanding, okay, if I try to use Facebook in this way, this might happen, because I've heard other activists saying that this might happen. And so I'm very impressed by how well people quickly figure out what's happening and do their best to try to work around it. So all of that being said, it shouldn't be the case that platforms are helpful by accident and not by design. And these platforms are also providing platforms for serious harassment. There's been some questions specifically around gender equality, and one thing that we've noticed is that in particular, LGBTQ related content in our region gets reported and it gets removed, and it happens over and over and over again, even after we've had very extensive conversations with platforms saying, you need to do better. You need to do better in our region. You need to make sure your own moderators aren't biased. You need to make sure your algorithms aren't biased. And yet people try to post, and I've seen it with my friends' pages. People post really basic sexual health information, for example, that will get removed. And so it's a real serious problem. So the last point I'll make is that, and I know we're coming close to the end of the discussion and thinking about solutions. One of the things that I think a lot of us in this discussion have pushed for and in the region is real co-design with the platforms. They cannot just make their policies and make their tools and then implement them and think there's not going to be problems, especially in environments that they don't necessarily understand. People in Menlo Park are not the same as people in Halab. It's a very different need. And so they need to co-design with us, with civil society, with academics from the region who have researched these issues, with activists, to actually come to a solution that is going to best uphold human rights and to ensure that their platforms are not actually being used to harm people's rights, but being used for democracy and for organizing.
Thank you very, very much, Dia. And we have received a lot of questions. We are running out of time, and according to schedule, we should actually wrap up in 5 minutes. That is not going to happen. So we will go on a bit over time. We will take a couple of questions. But before that, I would like to turn to Sara. You have a long experience of working in and with the MENA region, working on support for democracy and freedom of expression, and you also work on the Stockholm Internet Forum. So I think it would be interesting also to hear, say, a donor perspective on what can and should be done. What role can Sweden or other donors play in supporting regional efforts at a time of shrinking space, and why is it important?
Thank you. And yes, my first point to us as donors is that we need to be good allies. We need to be good allies to actors who are trying to be a positive force for the respect of human rights and democratization in the region, such as the actors that are present today in this roundtable. And what I mean by that is not just offering support, which is really important, and SIDA and Sweden are committed, and we have to stay committed to supporting civil society actors, contributing to independent media islands that can sort of counterbalance the shrinking space, disinformation, etc., and to work for increased accountability. And we do support organizations that document and report on human rights abuses, verify data, and counteract disinformation. We cannot only look at support through our development channels, even though that is very central, but political support and political protection is also key, and sometimes even more important in cases of shrinking space that we see. And that means that we also have to have, as Sweden and as other like-minded countries, needs to have a coherency in how we approach these issues of human rights, democratization, and shrinking space in our foreign policy, both in our political dialogue and as well as in our development aid. And I think this is key for Sweden, and we have even initiated a drive for democracy recently to really, as a reaction to the shrinking space and backsliding that we see, and to ensure that we really focus on contributing to support to keep the space as open as possible, whether it's online and offline, and include components of the protection, safety, and security also in the support that we offer, which is really important, and strategies to sort of handle the risks that have been mentioned by all the other speakers today. Gender equality obviously is also a major part of that, and I would also want to say that one of the things I think we as donors also can ensure is to not contribute to a wider digital divide, where even though more people than ever before are connected and have access to digital space, and there are still people that are excluded from those, and that exclusion is very detrimental, and we need to ensure that as much as possible marginalized groups are also given a voice. And that's the beauty of the internet, that marginalized voice people and groups can raise their voices that previously did not have channels to access, but we need to ensure that that also happens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I will now let Noura pick up a couple of the questions that have been coming in, and we will see how and to what extent our speakers will have a chance towards the end to maybe pick up on a couple of them. But let me also say to everyone who has posted questions, we will harvest the questions, we will bring them with us, and we will also see if these are things that we possibly outside of the Stockholm Forum, but as the Swedish Dialogue Institute can possibly follow up on in the future. So Noura, welcome to raise a couple of the questions that have been coming in.
I want to start by thanking all the participants who have asked questions in the chat, and we have received many great questions, but given the time, I will stick to just presenting 3 of them. And the first one refers to connecting to offline networks, where the question is, how do these digital communication channels connect to offline networks such as unions, syndicates, and civil society in organizing and mobilizing? We have a second question on how can we increase accountability online and reduce the prevalence of hate speech without increasing the traceability and risk of repercussions for human rights defenders online? And lastly, a question that is also connected to public services. So has the panel given a thought about the public services, such as public security, being digitalized and the chance for civil society to execute their oversight functions of the application of digital tools and the data used that is collected using these tools? So those are some of the questions that our speakers can address, and we will take also the rest of the questions with us.
Thank you very much, Noura. And with that, I would like to turn back to our panel and go the whole floor around. You can pick and choose if there is any of these questions that you want to address. We will have now to have a strict 2-minute limit for each one of you. And I also want from each and every one of you one recommendation, one main takeaway from this session. And it's great if you also can point to who is this that recommendation to. Is it to a tech company? Is it to governments? Is it to civil society? Is it to donors? So we start in the same order. First, Rasha.
Thank you, Charlotta. Many good points being raised. I think one of the things that I'm focusing on right now that I'm writing about is the relation between virtual space and public space, the relation between the space, the online space and the street space, or whatever public space. It doesn't have to be like for demonstration purposes, but just a space for people to converse. It could be, you know, coffee shops, even though COVID-19 is not very helpful with that. But anyway, it's, you know, as has been pointed out, I guess repeatedly, it's, well, there are several players, obviously. The young people and the tech-savvy people have to keep pushing to create space. I literally believe that social media has in the past have helped us literally like carve out spaces in areas where these spaces were not present before. And I think we should continue to try to do that to the best of our abilities. You know, we each can go a little bit of the way, but together we can maybe do something. My main recommendation is to keep pushing for transparency. I think this is very, very important. Waleed also mentioned media literacy, which is also very important. Just raising awareness that these things happen. You know, I've talked to quite a few people about shadow banning, and it's taking me literally months to convince some people that this is actually happening. You know, because it's right for the document, obviously. For some people, it might take them months or even years to even realize that's happening to them, because you can just think, well, maybe I'm not writing, interesting stuff. Maybe just people are busy or tired, or, there could be a million reasons why people are not responding to you the way they have in the past. But it's taking quite some time for me to realize, and for me to convince others that, this is actually happening. And then I started hearing the term shadow ban, being flown around in different perspectives. So things like that are quite dangerous because they're not documented, and there's no way for the end user to document that this is actually happening. So if the platform denies them, it's your word against theirs, basically. So I do think that the one thing that we can do is to keep pressuring the platforms to do that. I think the donors have a great role to play in that, because, the donors can pressure the social media platforms for more transparency, before they get their money, basically. So I think every player in the game, end users, tech people, donors, civic society organizations, we should all be working to pressure, the tech companies, and obviously the governments, although I tend to think pressuring tech companies is easier than pressuring the governments. But we all need to work together on this.
Thank you very much, Rasha, and over to Waleed. And brief, please.
Yes, very briefly. I'd like to go back to Yemen because that's where I come from, and I think it is an urgent situation. I would like to send a message to the Swedish government, maybe via SIDA. You know that Swedes have been involved in the Yemeni peace process, and they've tried to broker a deal. And one thing that I think would be very, very important to not underestimate is the impact that technology has had in fostering the problems that Yemen is going through right now. The animosity, the hate speech, the disinformation happening online. And so my proposal is that don't only take a top-down approach, also take a bottom-up approach by leveraging the potential of knowledge. And this is through research, this is through trainings, through projects on the ground, through partners that you have, because oftentimes I hear that Yemen is in a conflict state. We can't do much in Yemen, but that's actually precisely why you should do more, because we cannot wait until the situation resolves itself. More focus on Yemen in terms of providing training to the civil society activists, to the persons who are working on the ground to reveal the truth to the public, to minimize tension, to minimize conflict, to bring up the truth, to build up the momentum for peace. That cannot happen from with only leaders and governments taking charge, also with civil society and educators. And I per se would like to follow up on this with you if possible, to take this further, and hopefully we'll do something positive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Waleed. Marwa?
Thank you, Charlotte. I want to answer question number 3 on public security. And that's something that we haven't actually discussed, but I'm really glad this question came up. So governments in our region have also been deploying many technologies. Some of them are for public good, or they say so. Governments in our region are rushing to adopt many technological solutions, from biometric IDs to biometric driving licenses. We've seen also recently in the COVID-19 pandemic the use of contact tracing apps. All done also without public consultation or transparency, let alone the fact that there aren't actual legislation in place that would protect the collection and processing of citizens' personal data, among others. And the role of civil society organizations, including us, Access Now, is to look at those technologies and in some cases audit them technologically if that's possible. In many cases also to look at the intended use of those technologies and how the government are actually using them. For example, the contact tracing apps being used to stop the transmission or slow the transmission of the virus, but in reality it can be used to build an infrastructure for mass surveillance. Also on the recommendation side, and to build or to end on a positive note, I'm conscious that I might have come across as the pessimistic in the room. So to rectify that, I think it's really like I'm very optimistic about the fact that there's so many of us in this room today, but also many other civil society organizations and activists that are watching this space. It's very rapid. It moves very quickly from deployment of technologies and how they are used for good, but also when governments utilize them or abuse them for their own purposes. But we are still able to come together, monitor and push back really, and try to still ensure that this space remains civic and open and free for all to use. And my one recommendation would be to social media companies, and to build on what everyone else said, be transparent and also be inclusive. And by inclusive, I don't mean bringing us again into a consultation, but and listening to us. We need people to actually listen and take our recommendations into consideration and see the results of those consultations being translated into actual policies. I think that's extremely important at this point in terms of engagement with private companies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marwa. So we move over to Dia.
Great, and I'm very conscious of time, so I'm just gonna dive right into the recommendations piece. And I'm going to give two recommendations. One, following up on what I said earlier about, the fact is that the internet is a global thing, and legislation that is being passed outside of our region is having a very big impact. So for governments, especially governments in the EU and for the US, where a lot of tech companies are based, you need to be considering people outside of your country. Think of things in a global way. And that means that those of us who are based in those places, we have a lot of work to do, getting our voice heard and pushing those governments to take us seriously and to take our region seriously. So that's one thing. And then the second thing, and this is something that is happening, and it's happening more and more all the time, and I'm very excited about it, is for us in the region, in civil society, to be in solidarity with each other. To be supporting each other's work, sharing resources, amplifying each other's voices. And, of course, we talked about some of the differences today, but there's also a lot of similarities. So as much as we can work with each other to address these issues, I think that we're going to be much more successful. And we've already seen some success there with tech companies kind of being pushed to listen to us more, because we're coming together in open letters, we're coming together in statements, and we're saying, there are some similarities you need to address, you need to do more resourcing. So I think that's something that's been very encouraging. So those are my two recommendations.
Thank you very much, Dia. Mohammed?
Thank you, Charlotta. So don't worry, I'll be very brief. My recommendation actually is addressed to donors and will be the creation of a network of cooperation and intercommunication between digital platforms operating in the same fields, like peace building and democratic engagement across the Middle East and North African region, in order to create synergies between them and strengthen this network of digital platforms so that they can share their experiences, learn from each other, and build together a more secure, supportive, and democratic digital space in the MENA region and within Shoe Barnamesik. We are at your disposal to participate in this project at any time with pleasure.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Nadeem?
Yes, I will be also brief. I mean, I want to answer the question about accountability, because I think it's important. Part of our recommendation is to, as much as possible, to hold companies and governments accountable to their doings, especially when it comes to technologies, surveillance technologies that are being produced, specifically in the Palestinian context. I mean, a context of decades of occupation, a context that was declared by Human Rights Watch as an apartheid reality. The Israeli government and the companies supported by the Israeli government are producing technologies of surveillance and being used in the kind of laboratory on the Palestinians, but later on being exported to many regimes, including Arab regimes and others. And these companies should be held accountable. We know, all of us, are the infamous company NSO and others who are using these technologies. But unfortunately, there are also cases of European governments who are producing and selling these technologies to non-democratic and oppressive regimes. And accountability, I think, is the key word here.
Thank you, Nadeem, and Sara, last but not least.
Thank you, and I share a lot of what has already been said, so I will also try to be brief. I'm also an optimist at heart, but I also know that positive change or positive developments in this area don't come by itself. It doesn't happen automatically. We have to reclaim our right to that space, a civic space, whether it's online and offline. And I hear you, Mohammed, about networking and exchanging ideas. I think that is needed on all different type of levels in the region, but also globally. And something that we can, as also, which I didn't mention before, but we as donors also can contribute to is ensuring that there is space at international forums for civil society actors working on this to participate and influence the normative discussion on this. And, you know, Marwa was also talking about the need for this, and finding, you know, contributing to global solutions, you know, relating back to what Dia was saying about the global dimension, and being an ally again in this. And in terms of recommendations, you know, I think there are several recommendations included in this, but I would also want to stress again inclusive participation, and that is something that we have to work on also on different levels, not just on grassroots levels, which is super important, but also ensure that those voices are heard at the international forums as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Sara. Thanks to all of our speakers. I think this has been an absolutely amazing panel. I have learned a lot from each and every one of you. I wish we could have gone on, and I think that there are many reasons to continue this discussion. I will not make, we have gone 15 minutes over time. I will not make any attempt of doing a major summary, but I can just conclude that the situation is extremely complex, that the limits in the civic space are also reflected in the limits in the digital space, and what we all need to work for is to create the space and maintain the space for inclusive participation. I think you've all pointed to the challenges being enormous, but you've also shown that it's not all doom and gloom, but that there is a lot of creativity out there and lots of work that is going on. Among the problems that have been highlighted are, of course, the questions on content moderation and lack of transparency around that. But you've also pointed to the value of networking and of dialogue. I'm very glad to have had this chance to have a dialogue with all of you today. We hope to continue in one way or the other. And I would just like to thank our speakers once again for your extremely valuable contributions. Thank you very much, Rasha, Waleed, Marwa, Mohammed, Dia, Sara, and Nadeem. Thanks for being with us. Thanks to everyone who have listened in, and we look forward to continue the discussion. Bye.